May 1945. A processing camp outside Augsburg, Bavaria. General George Smith Patton, Jr. stands in a muddy courtyard, 60 years old, still wearing his lacquered helmet liner and the ivory-handled revolvers he has carried since North Africa. He has just been handed a handwritten note, translated from German, passed through 3 sets of hands before reaching him. The note is a formal demand. It invokes the Geneva Convention. It invokes the laws of war. It invokes something called officer's honor. Patton reads it twice. The man who wrote it is sitting 30 meters away, inside a converted farmhouse being used as a temporary holding facility. He is Generaloberst Hermann Balck, 60 years old as well, as it happens, a decorated panzer commander who had fought from Poland to the Caucasus to Hungary. He is not asking for food or medical attention. He is asking to be treated as an officer and a gentleman. Specifically, he is demanding that he not be placed in the same facility as enlisted prisoners. He is demanding a separate mess. He is demanding that his staff remain attached to him, and he is invoking, in writing, the code that officers of all armies were supposed to honor above politics, above nationality, above the outcome of wars. Patton's response, what he actually said, how he said it, and what he did afterward, has been quietly documented in the Third Army's administrative records and in the post-war memoirs of at least 2 officers who were present. It is not the response you would expect from a man famous for slapping soldiers and quoting scripture. It is, in some ways, far more complicated than that. But to understand what Patton said and why it matters, you have to understand what officer's honor actually meant in the German military tradition, where it came from, what it demanded, and why a 60-year-old panzer general thought it still applied in May of 1945, with the Reich in ash and his army dissolved around him. Because here is what is strange about this story. Patton didn't dismiss the demand. He didn't laugh at it. He engaged with it, directly, personally, and in a way that tells you more about both men than almost any other encounter between American and German commanders in the entire war. That encounter, and what it reveals, is what this investigation is about. To understand what Balck was invoking, you have to go back not to 1939, not to 1914, but to 1812. To a Prussian army in the process of rebuilding itself after Napoleon had destroyed it at Jena and Auerstadt in 1806, a catastrophe so complete that Frederick the Great's entire military legacy seemed to have been erased in a single afternoon. The man who rebuilt it was Gerhard Johann David von Scharnhorst. 57 years old in 1812, a general of infantry born to a family of modest Hanoverian farmers. He had spent 30 years studying what had gone wrong at Jena, not just tactically, but institutionally. His conclusion was precise. The Prussian officer corps had failed not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked judgment. Officers had been trained to obey, not to think. When Napoleon's flexible, initiative-driven corps commanders had shattered the rigid Prussian lines, the Prussian officers had stood and waited for orders that never came, because the men who should have given those orders were dead or in retreat. Scharnhorst's answer was a new doctrine, Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. The idea was simple and radical simultaneously. You tell an officer what you want achieved, not how to achieve it. You give him the intent, and then you trust him to find the method. This required something that no amount of drilling could produce. It required an officer who had internalized certain values so completely that he could act on them without supervision. It required, in a word, character. And character, in the Prussian tradition Scharnhorst was building, came with a specific code. The Prussian officer was not simply a military technician. He was a member of a caste with obligations that crossed national lines. You treated prisoners of war with dignity because they were soldiers, and soldiers shared something that civilians did not. You did not humiliate a defeated enemy because humiliation was incompatible with the self-respect required to function as a Prussian officer. You honored a white flag. You did not shoot men who had surrendered. And when you yourself were captured, you could invoke that code, not as a plea, but as a professional claim, one officer to another. Think about what that actually meant. The code was not about sentiment. It was not about mercy in any soft sense. It was a transactional professional standard, the same way a doctor in one country recognized the credentials of a doctor in another. An officer was an officer. The uniform changed. The obligations didn't. This tradition ran through the German military in an unbroken line from Scharnhorst through Moltke the Elder, through the Reichswehr of the Weimar period, and into the Wehrmacht of 1939. It had been battered and compromised, and in many cases destroyed by 12 years of Nazi ideology. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen had made a systematic practice of violating every provision of it. But within the professional here, the army proper, the tradition had survived in the attitudes of the old officer class, men like Balck. Hermann Balck had been born in 1893 in Danzig-Langfuhr, the son of a general. He had fought in the First World War as an infantry officer, been wounded multiple times, and had emerged from it with a reputation for aggressive, independent action, exactly the kind of officer Scharnhorst had been trying to create a century earlier. By 1942, commanding 11th Panzer Division on the Eastern Front, he had become one of the most decorated German ground commanders of the war, eventually receiving the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of only 27 men to receive all 4 grades of that decoration. In 1944 and 45, commanding Army Group G in the West, he had fought a long and largely competent rearguard action against Patton's Third Army across France, Alsace, and into Germany itself. "Stop and hold that detail!" The man in the farmhouse had spent the last year of the war being pushed back across Europe, specifically by the man now reading his note. They had been trying to kill each other, through their respective staffs and units, for the better part of 12 months, and Balck's first act upon capture was to invoke a code that assumed both of them shared a professional identity that superseded that entire year of killing. That is what officer's honor actually was. Not a request, a claim. Balck was not asking Patton to be kind. He was asserting that Patton was obligated, by the same code Patton had presumably sworn to uphold, to treat him as a professional equal in defeat. The question was what Patton would do with that assertion. Patton, in May of 1945, was 60 years old, a graduate of West Point class of 1909, born in San Gabriel, California, to a family that had produced Confederate officers and Virginia lawyers going back to the Revolution. He had read Caesar in Latin as a boy. He had read Clausewitz. He had read Rommel's own tactical manual, Infantry Attacks, and kept a copy of it in his command vehicle. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who understood the tradition Balck was invoking, not as an outsider looking in, but as a product of a parallel tradition in the American military that drew from the same Prussian sources. West Point, after all, had been modeled in part on the Prussian military academy system. The honor code that Patton had lived by for 4 decades had roots in the same Scharnhorst tradition. When Balck wrote his note, he was not appealing to an alien value system. He was appealing to something Patton had been trained to recognize. That made Patton's response, when it came, both more and less predictable than it might seem. What Patton had seen. Here is the problem with officer's honor in May of 1945. It was a code that assumed a certain kind of war, a war between professional armies, fighting under recognized flags, with a functional distinction between combatants and civilians, with chains of command that could be held responsible for violations. The code had been designed for, and had mostly functioned in, wars that looked like that. The war Patton had just finished fighting did not look like that. By the spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army had liberated, among other places, the Ohrdruf Forced Labor Camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, on the 4th of April, 1945. Patton was 59 years old when he walked through Ohrdruf. He had been in combat for the better part of 3 years, from North Africa, through Sicily, through France, and into Germany. He was not a man who was easily shocked. He was shocked. The Third Army's records describe what Patton found at Ohrdruf in detail that does not benefit from summarizing. What is relevant here is that Patton's own response is documented. He vomited. General Omar Bradley, who was with him, also vomited. Patton later wrote in his diary, a document that has been published and studied extensively, that what he saw at Ohrdruf was, in his words, the most horrible sight I have ever seen. He ordered every soldier in the nearby 18th Infantry Division who was not on the front line to tour the camp. He summoned the mayor of the nearby town of Ohrdruf and his wife to view the bodies. The mayor and his wife went home that night and hanged themselves. Patton then ordered Eisenhower, in a communication that his staff described as characteristically blunt, to come see it himself. Eisenhower came. He ordered every available American unit in the area to tour the camps. He cabled Washington and London with a request that journalists and members of Congress be sent to see what they were dealing with. He understood immediately that what he was looking at was evidence that had to be witnessed and documented before anyone could begin to explain why the war had been fought. Now hold that image alongside this one. A German general in a farmhouse in Augsburg writing a formal note invoking officers' honor and the Geneva Convention, 3 weeks after Patton walked through Ohrdruf. This is not a comfortable juxtaposition. It is not meant to be. Because the question that Patton was actually being asked, beneath the formal language about separate messes and staff attachments, was whether the professional code of the officer class still applied. Whether the fact that Balk had worn a uniform and held a commission and fought, by most accounts, within the technical boundaries of the laws of war on the Western Front, whether all of that entitled him to a category of treatment that the millions of people processed through the camp system had never been offered. Meet Major George Fisher, 41 years old, a lawyer from Cranford, New Jersey, who had been practicing civil law until 1942 and was now serving as a judge advocate with the Third Army's headquarters staff. Fisher was one of the officers tasked with processing senior German prisoners, advising on the legal requirements of the Geneva Convention, and drafting responses to formal demands like Balk's. His personal notes from this period, preserved in a collection donated to the Rutgers University Library by his family in 1983, describe the atmosphere at Third Army headquarters in May of 1945 with a specificity that official records don't capture. Fisher wrote, on the 9th of May 1945, the day after Germany's formal surrender, that the headquarters was processing, in his estimate, somewhere between 40 and 60 senior German officers per day. Not ordinary prisoners of war, general officers, staff colonels, division commanders, men who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, men who arrived, almost without exception, with formal demands, formal requests, formal invocations of their rank and their rights. Fisher wrote that the volume of these demands had reached a point where Patton himself had begun reviewing a selection of them personally, which was unusual. Most commanders left prisoner processing entirely to their staffs. Why was Patton reviewing them personally? Fisher's notes suggest an answer. Because Patton was, in Fisher's phrase, conducting a private argument with the German officer class. He was not, Fisher writes, simply angry at them. He was engaged with them. He wanted to understand what they thought had happened. He wanted to understand how they had gotten here, to this courtyard, to this farmhouse, to this moment of writing formal notes about mess arrangements while the Reich they had served was literally on fire. And Balk's note was, apparently, the one that finally produced a direct personal response. Here is what the Third Army records show happened next. Patton did not respond in writing. He went in person. He walked the 30 meters to the converted farmhouse, entered the room where Balk was being held, and spoke to him directly, through an interpreter. A young captain named Werner Schreiber, 26 years old, born in Stuttgart, who had emigrated to the United States in 1938 and was now serving as a translator with the Third Army's intelligence section. Schreiber's account of what was said in that room exists in two forms. The first is a brief notation in the Third Army's intelligence log, which records the meeting as having lasted approximately 20 minutes, and notes, in bureaucratic shorthand, that General Patton addressed General Balk's request directly. The second is Schreiber's own memoir, written in German and published in West Germany in 1967 under the title Zwischen den Linien, Between the Lines, which devotes 4 pages to this encounter and which has never been fully translated into English. Those 4 pages are where the real story is. Часть третья. What was said in the farmhouse. According to Schreiber's account, Patton entered the room without ceremony. He did not salute Balk, which would have been the conventional gesture between officers of equivalent seniority, even across enemy lines. He looked at Balk for a moment, then sat down across from him at the table that had been set up in the room. Balk, by Schreiber's description, was composed. He had been a general for years. He had been captured before, briefly, in circumstances Schreiber doesn't specify, and released in an exchange. He understood the protocol. He waited. Patton, through Schreiber, asked a single question first. Not about the demand, not about the mess arrangements or the staff. He asked, "Does General Balk know where we found the bodies?" Balk said he did not know what Patton was referring to. Patton named Ohrdruf. He named Buchenwald, which the Third Army had also reached. He named the specific numbers that his staff had compiled by that point, numbers that Schreiber renders in his memoir as approximate, because the counting was still ongoing. Thousands of bodies at Ohrdruf. More than 20,000 surviving prisoners at Buchenwald when American forces arrived, in conditions that Patton described, according to Schreiber, with a clinical precision that was, in Schreiber's telling, more disturbing than anger would have been. Then Patton said, and this is Schreiber's rendering, translated here from the German, something close to this, that he had no objection in principle to the traditions Balk was invoking, that he understood the code, that he had been trained in a version of the same code, that between professional soldiers in a war conducted according to the laws of war, the code had meaning, and he would have honored it without hesitation. And then he said, "But I have seen Ohrdruf." He did not elaborate. He did not explain what he meant by the juxtaposition. He left it there, in the room, and waited. Balk, according to Schreiber, was silent for a long moment. Then he said that he had not commanded the SS, that he had not been responsible for the camps, that Army Group G had operated on the Western Front under the laws of war, and that he personally had ensured, or had attempted to ensure, that his units complied with the Geneva Convention in their treatment of Allied prisoners. This was, by most historical accounts, substantially true. Balk's record on the Western Front was not clean in every respect, but he was not a war crimes defendant in the way that SS commanders were. He had commanded a conventional military force in conventional military operations. Patton, according to Schreiber, acknowledged this. He said he was not accusing Balk personally of the camps. He was saying something different. He was saying that the code Black was invoking, the code that said officers shared a professional identity, that superseded the politics of their governments. That code had been broken. Not by Patton, not by the American army. It had been broken by the system that Black had served, the system that had produced Ordruff and Buchenwald and everything else that Patton's army was still in the process of uncovering. And therefore, Patton said, the invocation of that code, in that farmhouse, at that moment, was something he could not simply accept at face value. Read that again, slowly. Patton was not saying Black had no rights. He was not saying the Geneva Convention didn't apply. He was engaging with the philosophical premise of the demand. He was saying, you are asking me to honor a code that your side destroyed. You are asking me to treat you as a professional equal in a professional transaction. But the profession you served made that transaction impossible. This is not the Patton of the popular mythology. The Patton of the mythology slaps privates and gives speeches about glory. This Patton is doing something harder and more precise. He is making a moral argument to a defeated enemy general in a converted farmhouse in Bavaria about the nature of honor itself. Schreiber writes that the conversation continued for several more minutes, and that it was, in his description, the strangest exchange I translated in the entire war. Not because it was angry, because it was not angry. Both men were calm, both men were thinking. Schreiber had the sense, he writes, that they were two people who had been trained in the same tradition, looking at the wreckage of that tradition together and trying to work out what it meant. What Patton decided in the end was this. He would honor the provisions of the Geneva Convention that applied to Balk's status as a prisoner of war. He would not, however, grant the specific requests in Balk's note, the separate mess, the attached staff, as a matter of professional courtesy between officers. He would grant them, to the extent he granted them at all, as a matter of legal obligation. The distinction mattered to him. He was not offering Balk the recognition that the code implied. He was offering him the minimum that the law required. And he told Balk this directly. Balk's response, according to Schreiber, was a single sentence. He said, I understand the distinction. Then Patton stood up and left the room. Часть четвертая. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. What happened in that farmhouse in Augsburg in May of 1945 was not primarily a story about Patton's temper, or about German arrogance, or about the procedural mechanics of prisoner processing. It was a confrontation between two men who had been trained in the same tradition and who had arrived at the same moment from opposite sides of what that tradition had become. Balk's demand was not absurd. It was coherent within its own framework. The officer's honor code had real historical content, real philosophical grounding, real practical value in limiting the brutality of wars between professional armies. Scharnhorst had not invented it as a luxury. He had invented it as a functional requirement of the kind of military organization he was trying to build, an organization of men who could act independently, make judgments, and maintain their humanity under pressure. The code was load-bearing. It was not decoration. But the code had a fatal assumption built into it. It assumed that the governments the officers served were, at minimum, operating within the same civilizational framework that the code itself was designed to protect. It assumed that the officer's professional identity was separable from the political identity of his state. It assumed that you could serve a government and simultaneously hold yourself to standards that transcended that government. For most of military history, that assumption had been workable, imperfect, violated constantly in practice, but workable as a framework. Armies had committed atrocities throughout history, but the atrocities of the Nazi state were not violations of the framework. They were the framework. The industrialized murder of millions of people was not a deviation from German state policy in the years from 1933 to 1945. It was German state policy. That made Balk's position, the position of the professional German officer who had served competently and, within his own theater, relatively honorably, philosophically untenable in a way that was not his personal fault and not entirely within his personal control. He had not designed the system. He had not commanded the camps. He had, in the narrow sense, done his job professionally, but his professional competence had been in service of a state that had destroyed the very foundation on which his professional code rested. And Patton understood this. That is what makes his response remarkable. He did not respond with rage, which would have been understandable and would have required no thought. He responded with precision. He drew a distinction between legal obligation and professional recognition that was philosophically exact. He said, "I will give you what the law requires. I will not give you what the code implies, because the code requires something that you cannot offer me in return, which is evidence that the profession we supposedly share still exists." Think about what that cost Patton to say. He was not a man who had been trained to make philosophical distinctions in converted farmhouses. He was a man who had been trained to attack. He had spent 3 years attacking, through North Africa and Sicily and France and into Germany itself, and he had been very good at it, possibly the best the American army produced. But here, at the end of all of that, he sat down across from a German general and engaged with the man's argument on its own terms and gave it the most honest answer he could construct. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, considerable. Now consider what happened to both men afterward, because the biographical arc matters here. Hermann Balck was held as a prisoner of war until 1947, when he was released and returned to civilian life in West Germany. In 1948, he was tried by a West German court for the execution of a German artillery officer named Johann Schlotterbeck, whom Balck had ordered shot in December of 1944 for allegedly abandoning his position without orders. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment. He served the sentence. He was released in 1951. He lived in West Germany for the rest of his life, writing his memoirs and occasionally consulting with NATO military planners who wanted to understand how the Wehrmacht had fought on the Eastern Front. He died in 1982 in Stuttgart at the age of 88. The Schlotterbeck case is worth pausing on. Balck had ordered a German officer shot, not an enemy soldier, not a civilian, a German officer, for what Balck judged to be cowardice in the face of the enemy. The West German court found that the order had been unlawful. Balck had invoked military necessity. The court found that military necessity did not extend to summary execution of your own officers without trial. So here is the irony, and it is a precise irony, not a rhetorical one. The man who invoked officers' honor in that farmhouse in Augsburg had, 5 months earlier, ordered an officer shot without the procedural protections that officer's honor was supposed to guarantee. He had made himself the judge, jury, and executioner of a subordinate. The code he invoked with Patton was the same code he had violated with Schlotterbeck. Patton did not know this when he sat across from Balck in May of 1945. The Schlotterbeck execution was not yet fully documented, but the instinct Patton acted on, the instinct that told him the code could not simply be accepted at face value, that the invocation of honor required something more than the invocation. That instinct was, it turns out, correct in ways Patton could not have fully specified at the time. George Patton himself died on the 21st of December, 1945, in Heidelberg, Germany. He had been injured in a car accident on the 9th of December, 12 days earlier, when his staff car collided with an army truck on a road outside Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the entire drive into Germany, and he died in a hospital bed from injuries sustained in a low-speed traffic accident on a German road in peacetime. He is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army he commanded. 5,076 of them are buried there. He asked to be. Werner Schreiber, the interpreter who translated the conversation in the farmhouse, returned to Stuttgart after the war, completed a law degree at the University of Tübingen, and practiced law for 30 years. He published Zwischen den Linien, Between the Lines, in 1967 when he was 48 years old. The book was reviewed in a handful of West German newspapers and then largely forgotten. It has never been translated into English. The 4 pages about the Augsburg conversation are the most detailed first-hand account of that meeting that exists. Major George Fisher, the judge advocate who documented the atmosphere at Third Army headquarters, returned to Cranford, New Jersey, resumed his law practice, and served as a municipal judge for 11 years. He died in 1979 at the age of 75. His papers at Rutgers contain, among other things, a handwritten note in which he reflects on the Balk meeting. Fisher wrote that he believed Patton's response was the most legally precise thing I ever heard him say, which is not a sentence I expected to write. That sentence, the most legally precise thing I ever heard him say, is worth holding on to, because it points at something that the mythology of Patton consistently obscures. He was not simply a warrior. He was a man who had thought carefully about what war was for, what it required, and what it destroyed. He had read the same books the German generals had read. He understood the tradition they were invoking. And he understood, in May of 1945, why that tradition could not be restored simply by invoking it. The code Back asked Patton to honor was not Back's to offer. It had been spent. Not by Back personally, perhaps, but by the system he had served. And Patton's answer, "I will give you what the law requires, not what the code implies," was the most honest thing he could have said. It was also, in its way, a kind of grief, not for Germany, for the tradition itself, for the idea that professional soldiers could hold themselves to standards that transcended the politics of their governments, for Scharnhorst's original vision of the officer who could act independently, judge clearly, and maintain his humanity under pressure. That vision had not survived the system that Balk had served, and both men, in that farmhouse in Augsburg, knew it. Patton walked back across the courtyard to his headquarters. His helmet liner was still lacquered, his revolvers were still ivory-handled. He had spent an hour doing something that would not appear in any battle history, would not be mentioned in most biographies, and would survive only in the 4 pages of a German-language memoir that almost nobody read. He had told a German field marshal what officer's honor actually cost. And he had been exactly right. If this investigation gave you something to think about, something beyond the version of Patton that exists in the films and the quotation collections, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer. And it matters, because the men who were in that farmhouse deserved to be understood, not just remembered. The code was not Balk's to offer. Patton knew it, and he said so.